Are we being misled about the dangers of saturated fats? Recent studies have raised serious questions about the long-held belief that saturated fats are bad for our hearts. Despite a decade of research, nearly 20 papers have found a lack of evidence to support limiting our consumption of saturated fats or replacing them with other types of fats. Yet, the government's most recent dietary guidelines continue to recommend limiting saturated fats to just 10% of our total energy intake. But is this advice based on solid evidence, or is it based on insufficient and inconsistent data? Are we missing the bigger picture when it comes to the role of saturated fats in our diets? The truth may be more complicated than we ever imagined, and the implications could be dire. Continue watching as we uncover the truth about saturated fats and their impact on our health. For decades, the government's dietary guidelines have advised us to limit our consumption of saturated fats as a way to reduce our risk of heart disease. But, new research is calling this advice into question. Saturated fats, found in foods such as dairy, red meat, and tropical oils, were once thought to be the enemy, but studies are now showing that the situation may not be so clear-cut. In 1990, the dietary guidelines put a specific cap on these fats at just 10% of our total calories, and this advice has remained unchanged in the most recent guidelines, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. As we question the science behind these guidelines, we must also ask whether they truly serve the best interests of the general public. Is it possible that we've been misguided about the role of saturated fats in our diet, and what could the consequences of this be? The idea that saturated fats were to blame for heart disease emerged in the late 1950s when scientists found that these fats raised cholesterol levels. But, recent studies have raised doubts about this theory and have suggested that the truth may be more complex. The influential 7 countries study, which compared heart disease outcomes with levels of saturated fat intake in 7 countries, was not a clinical trial and could not demonstrate cause and effect. Additionally, numerous methodological shortcomings were later identified, including non-random selection of countries, inclusion of only men, collection of dietary data from less than 5% of the total sample, and lack of contemporary statistical approaches to minimize confounding. Subsequent studies using similar approaches have failed to confirm the 7-country study's conclusions. Recognizing the need for more rigorous, clinical trial data, several countries, including the U.S., carried out large randomized controlled trials in the 1960s and 1970s. Altogether, these trials tested the diet-heart hypothesis in about 67,000 people. They tested levels of saturated fats, considered to be standard at the time versus lower amounts, and replaced saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats from vegetable oils. Despite this, these trials did not provide support for the diet-heart hypothesis. It is remarkable that despite these findings, the diet-heart hypothesis gained widespread acceptance in the 1970s and 1980s. The results of these trials were largely ignored, and a citation network analysis in 2018 found that 82% of reviews supportive of the diet-heart hypothesis cited only one clinical trial. The truth about the impact of saturated fats on heart disease may be more complicated than we ever imagined, and the implications of this could be significant. Reviews of clinical trial data have yielded mixed conclusions, with some studies showing an unfavorable effect of saturated fats on heart disease while others have shown no significant findings. One such study, the Finnish Mental Hospital study, which followed 4,000 men and women, showed a significant reduction in heart attacks and deaths among men on the experimental diet in one of the 2 hospitals included in the study. However, this effect was not seen in the other hospital or for the women in the trial. This study also widely came to be recognized as not being randomized and was therefore excluded from most later reviews on saturated fats. An updated systematic review by the Cochrane Group in 2020 reported that reducing dietary saturated fats reduced heart disease events, but had no effect on other endpoints including total mortality, heart disease mortality, and fatal heart attacks. Even the significant effect of saturated fats on heart disease events became non-significant when subjected to a sensitivity analysis that only included clinical trials which had successfully reduced saturated fat consumption while excluding those that intended to reduce saturated fat but were not successful. Therefore, there were effectively no significant findings in the 2020 Cochrane Review, which is consistent with an earlier Cochrane Review on this topic, in 2015. Moreover, the collective clinical trial data did not find that these fats caused increased mortality. Overall, there are serious concerns regarding the application of the clinical trial data for supporting the recommendation of a specific cap on dietary saturated fat intake. As more and more studies call into question the link between saturated fats and heart disease, we must question the validity of the guidelines that have long advised us to limit our consumption of these fats. Observational studies, which look at the association of certain factors with disease outcomes, have been collected for over 60 years. However, early collections of data from these studies have shown that there may not be a relation between saturated fat consumption and heart disease. Recent reviews of this large body of evidence have yielded mixed conclusions. Some meta-analyses of observational studies have found no significant association between saturated fats and heart disease, while others have suggested an association with a lower risk of heart disease when saturated fats are replaced with polyunsaturated fats. However, observational studies alone cannot establish causality and have significant limitations, such as potential for confounding, lack of information on all potential confounders, and measurement errors. A recent review of reviews of observational data reported that replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats did not convincingly reduce the risk of cardiovascular events or mortality. The belief that saturated fats cause heart disease is often linked to their ability to raise LDL cholesterol levels. However, the connection between cholesterol levels and heart disease is not as clear-cut as once thought. Clinical trials that aimed at reducing cholesterol levels by changing the diet have not shown reliable reduction in cardiovascular outcomes. Even though reductions in total cholesterol were observed in many of the trials, the evidence for benefit on longer-term clinical cardiovascular disease outcomes is inconclusive. Another explanation for this is that the decrease in LDL cholesterol levels primarily reflects reduced levels of large LDL particles, which have a weaker association with heart disease risk compared to small LDL particles, which tend to be less affected by saturated fat restriction. In addition, saturated fat intake also increases the levels of high-density lipoprotein, HDL, cholesterol, which improves the ratio of total to HDL cholesterol and is considered a robust marker of cardiovascular disease risk. Thus, the complex and multiple effects of saturated fats on blood lipids make the reliance on LDL cholesterol alone as an indicator of SFA-mediated cardiovascular disease risk overly simplistic. The latest research suggests that saturated fats should not be viewed in isolation, but as part of the food and dietary patterns in which they appear. Dairy products, for example, contain not only saturated fats but also a variety of other nutrients that interact with one another, such as fatty acids, proteins, vitamins, and minerals. This interaction between the different components of food, known as the food matrix, plays a crucial role in how our bodies metabolize and utilize nutrients. Guidelines based on whole foods, rather than isolated nutrients, have been promoted by the Food and Agricultural Organization, also known as FAO. They recognize that people consume foods in various amounts and combinations with each other, and that the overall dietary pattern, particularly the level of carbohydrates, has an important impact on how saturated fats are metabolized. Recently, the U.S. Dietary Guidelines has also moved away from nutrient-based recommendations, specifically with regard to total fat, yet the guidelines have not done so for saturated fat. The committee did, however, recognize the importance of the growing body of research on specific fatty acids, food matrix, and sources of fats, explicitly saturated fat. After reviewing the evidence, it's clear that limiting saturated fats to a specific percentage of total calories is not scientifically sound. Not only that, but this recommendation also fails to take into account the different effects of different food sources of these fats. The guidelines that suggest replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats also lacks proper scientific support. This is likely the reason many who practice ketogenic and carnivore lifestyles urge the latest Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee to reevaluate their stance on these recommendations and to consider the real impact of the different food sources of fats in the decision-making process. If you enjoyed this video, you'll be sure to enjoy this one. Also, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you get notified when I release a new video. Be sure to check out some of the recipes on my channel as well.